willows that were growing in these refugia, there would have been plenty of resources to build and maintain fires and shelters and things that would have allowed people to have lived rather nicely. Recent climatic reconstructions also show that in this shrub tundra zone, thanks to changed different currents in the ocean, the climate was much, much less harsh than we used to think. Summer temperatures might have been warmer there than they are in the same region today. Winter temperatures would have been pretty brutal, but...
Do those cores yield any evidence of human?
Not so far. Not so far that I'm aware. But they weren't looking for human materials. But so far as I know, they didn't stumble across any.
Right. How wide was the land mass?
From north to south, it was about 1,200 kilometers. And from east to west, it stretched from what we think of as Beringia today, stretched from the Mackenzie Delta all the way westward to the Verkhoyansk Mountains in northeast Siberia. It was a very large place.
It was huge.
Yeah, it was a very large place. And the southern part is where we're beginning to get evidence of reasonable habitation places. Yes?
Would you say the kilometers in miles?
Basically cut what I said in half. A kilometer is 0.61 of a mile. So, so roughly half, a little over half. Nancy Bigelow is a paleoecologist, friend and colleague at the University of Alaska, and she and her students took data from all of these kinds of cores and a lot of other sources of information on paleoenvironments, and they modeled what the environment would have been like all the way across Beringia. This is essentially Beringia all across here. The dark regions are areas that were going to be very cold, very dry, probably not habitable by people, especially over here. That was a huge ice field, and a little bit of ice up here. But notice in the central area, and particularly in the southern area, those colors, whatever they are, I'm red-green colorblind, so I have no idea what those are. These are areas that would have been completely habitable.
Is that southern part by the Aleutians?
Yep, that's the Aleutians. That's the Aleutians right there. Those are the commanders we were talking about that belong to Russia. The rest of them are ours. That's Atu. And so this area would have been very productive for human habitation, something that we hadn't anticipated some time ago. I'm going to talk in a little bit about an archaeological site, a very important one in northern Siberia. It's called Yana. It's actually called the Yana Rhinoceros Site, and it's right here. This is the modern coast of Siberia, and Yana is very near the north coast of Siberia in Russia. But of course, during the last glacial maximum, when sea level was so low, the north coast of Beringia was much further north in the west, but not in the east. Here's the modern coast of Alaska, and you'll see that the coast of Alaska was essentially the same during the last glacial maximum. So now, one of the major questions is how many points of entry were there into the interior of the Americas if we just make the simple assumption and recognize that it's an assumption that people were living on the land bridge. Was it just an interior route down into the middle through that ice-free corridor? Or because people were probably living here on southern Beringia, might there have been a significant movement along the coast? I'll tell you my view, and I think the evidence is in favor of it, but it's hardly solidified or a dead cert yet. Most of the earliest sites are along the Pacific coast. One of the earliest is right there in southern South America at over 14,000 years ago, Monteverde. We know ecologically people move faster along coastal environments than they do in the interior, so it seems likely that early movement along the coast would have moved people further south more quickly, but undoubtedly at some point people moved through that ice-free corridor. But once the ice began to melt and recede, it would have taken some time before it was actually habitable. And by that time, people were already moving down the coast.
Are they moving by sea or by land?
We don't know.
Oh.
We have no evidence of boats. My view is you can't get to northeast Siberia without boats. You have to cross bodies of water to get there, even rivers. You don't have to go along the coastline. Even if you were in the interior, there are lots of very large rivers that without some sort of watercraft or experience crossing water, you don't even get to the starting point. So I have no trouble assuming that at 17 to 25,000 years ago, people could have operated watercraft along the coast. After all, people made it to Australia 45,000 years ago or greater using watercraft. So the technology was easily available. One way to get at some of this material is to generate more and better ancient genetic data. Earlier is better than younger because it puts us closer to the time of people living on the Beringian landform. So we were fortunate to begin work with a colleague at the University of Alaska, Ben Potter, who's excavated a site called the Upward Sun River site in central Alaska. It's not far from Fairbanks. He excavated it in 2011, or 2010, 2013, major publications in 11 and 14. It's just above the Tanana River floodplain, and it's a nicely, deeply stratified site. There are 4 depositional components. They range in age from the bottom is a little over 13,000 years old, and the top about 10,000 years old. And in component 3, he found 3 infant burials, very, very close together, 2 of them in a single grave. And those date, all 3 date to 11,500 years ago, by far the earliest material ever recovered, human remains ever recovered at northern latitudes. So that places it in the late Pleistocene and well in eastern Beringia. The Healy Lake Tribal Council, the native community nearest the site, and the Tanana Chiefs Conference all were very anxious to have analyses done on these infants. They wanted to know relationships among them. Could they be related to modern peoples today? They were very keen to have scientific study done. They gave Ben and us permission to do a variety of scientific studies on those human remains. We sampled 100 milligrams of bone from what's called the petrous portion of the temporal. It's where it's the inner bone that contains the ossicles of the ear. This is just an illustration from one of Ben's publications on the location of these burials. Here are 2 side by side in a single burial pit underneath a hearth.
Is recovering DNA from that kind of a find very difficult?
Yeah. That's the short answer. But I have a very talented group of doctoral students, in particular Justin Tackney, who did part of this work or he did this work for part of his doctoral dissertation. He's actually here now as a postdoc and a lab manager in my lab here at KU. And so we were able to extract DNA. We focused on the mitochondrial lineages. We wanted to know how these were related to other Native American lineages. If they were, we were able to enrich the sample so we could get more of the mitochondria than normally we would by using a hybridization probe method. And then we sequenced both of these infants on a particular machine that's illustrated here. That's just the technical bits. And Justin was wildly successful, beyond any hope, actually. For each of those, he got well over 20,000 reads of DNA sequence. We got 100% coverage of the mitochondrial genome for each one of them. The one that worked the worst, we observed every single nucleotide base in the mitochondrial genome 117 times, and some more than that, and the other one almost 200 observations per base. That's called a deep read. Compare that to the 1X for Malta. So we're quite confident we know exactly what that mitochondrial genome is, and if anybody wants the details, I can come back and we can talk about how we do that enrichment and generate those sequences. The bottom line is that the first individual from Upward Sun River had a mitochondrial lineage that we recognize as C1b. It had all of the classic diagnostic markers for a C1b maternal lineage. You can ignore what the letters and numbers mean, it's just terminology. It also had a private polymorphism, that is, it had a mutation that we've never seen in any other of the mitochondrial lineages before. The other individual was a different lineage, we call them haplogroups sometimes, known as B2. B2 is widely distributed throughout the Americas. It's very high frequency in the US Southwest and in highland Peru. And it's not common hardly anywhere else. And I won't bore you with the detail. There have been arguments about why you should never find B2 in the far north. They relate to some physiological principles. The fact of the matter is, until this study, neither C1b nor B2 lineages had been found in high latitude populations, living or ancient. Although, when she was a postdoc with me some years ago, Jenny Raff did find a B2 on the Alaska Peninsula, which is the beginning of the Aleutian chain, which was a surprise then, but now we found one much, much further north. Jenny's now on the faculty here at KU as well, and we continue to collaborate on projects like this. C1 and B2 have been found in other ancient samples, but much further south. So for example, all of the orange dots on this map are modern populations that have the frequency of C1b at some appreciable frequency, I guess greater than 40%. And the blue dots are the same, modern populations that have haplogroup B at moderately high frequency. And the ones with the black circles around them, or whatever color that is, are the ancient samples. And you'll notice that Upward Sun River is way up here, much further north than anything else. Hourglass Cave and Wizard's Beach, no, it's Hourglass Cave and Paisley Caves in Oregon are old and have yielded haplogroup B individuals, and Wizard's Beach is also quite old and has yielded a C1 individual, but other than that, everything else is further south. And I'm just going to mention this, and if somebody wants an explanation later, I can give it. Basically, the sequences we obtained for both of these are very, very near the root of the phylogeny of these lineages, which means they haven't changed since those lineages first arose. We would expect much more change, more private polymorphisms if they were from people or individuals later in time. And that's going to become important in a second. One of the things that's interesting is because this is mitochondrial data, these two infants, even though they were both essentially neonates and buried at exactly the same time in the same grave, are not maternally related.
Really?
The archaeologist and the osteologist that worked the site were convinced they were a set of twins that didn't survive much past birth, and they were astonished and initially unbelieving when we told them they didn't have the same mother. They might have had the same father, that we don't know yet. You can read the rest of that if you care. The thing I want to draw your attention to is our inference was, oh, this is early. Here are lineages that we've never observed in the north in an area where we think there should have been lots of variation to give rise to Native Americans moving south at about this time. And now we have evidence that there was more genetic variability in the region early on, except for, and I didn't know this at the time, well, I'll come back to it, I guess. The fact that they're there might speak to the fact that this is a residual Beringian population that represents some of that variability that has disappeared over time. And we oftentimes get really close to a good answer and then get disappointed. And after we had published this paper and argued that Upward Sun River is a residual early Beringian population, we can think of it as remnants of the source population of all Native American groups. One of my archaeological colleagues, whom I collaborate a lot with, pointed out to me, and this is the one where you can just focus on the bottom bit, there's good archaeological evidence that about 11 to 12,000 years ago, there was a back migration from the Great Plains going north through the ice-free corridor. Maybe there were people coming south as well, but certainly there's archaeological evidence of a back migration all the way to central Alaska. And he said, well, you know, maybe what you're looking at are descendants of that back migration from the south rather than remnants of an earlier population in the north. And that's when I found that cartoon. To understand and help us clarify our thinking about how that might work, it was clear that we needed to look further afield. We started looking at archaeological sites and genetic data from Siberia in addition to Malta. Turns out across northern Siberia there are lots of early archaeological sites starting at 40 to 45,000 years ago and continuing right on through the last glacial maximum. Right here in northern Siberia is a site called Yana, the Yana rhinoceros site. It has vast amounts of skeletal material from rhinoceros and mammoth and all kinds of things. Really nicely formed artifacts, needles, needle cases. People were making tailored clothing to live in the far north. This site dates to 32,000 years ago. Many people thought for a long time, okay, they were up there hunting in the summer 32,000 years ago. Winter gets ugly, everybody goes back down south, and they abandon the Arctic. It's a one-shot thing. We now have good evidence that people were living year-round at Yana throughout the entirety of the last glacial maximum. So that's led to a new archaeological inference that requires testing that by 32,000 people were living all over the northern tier, the northern latitudes of Siberia, like at Yana, and other sites have now been discovered but not yet published. And as they moved around this northern landscape, many of them found their way to the interior of the Bering Land Bridge as sea level dropped. And as climate began to change radically, those in and getting colder and glacials advanced, those in western Beringia did indeed, it appears, move south and followed the climate away from there. But because of those refugia in Beringia, the central Beringians did not. And they stayed throughout the last glacial maximum, what we refer to as the standstill population. They developed a series of distinctive tool types that archaeologists are familiar with. And after the last glacial maximum, people in Asia began to move back to the north and east, introduced some new cultural materials, lithics in particular, and it's a nice, neat story. But it also has lots of problems. If we really have to talk about people moving through Asia, like Malta would suggest, with Native American genomes, where are they in Asia today? What's the demographic scenario that accounts for their loss? And that's true for the nuclear genome as well as the maternal lineages that I've talked about. And it turns out that the closest lineages, both in the nuclear genome and mitochondria, to Native American populations today are all found in southern Siberia and northern Mongolia, quite a ways from northeast Siberia, where we think people were moving through under this alternative scenario. And so then the question becomes, is isolation really essential for the development of a distinctive Native American genome? I personally think it is, but there's an alternative view that genetically we can't reject just yet. We know that, for example, down here in the Altai and Sayan Mountains is where we find the closest related lineages in Asia to modern indigenous American populations. And then we know that by 13 to 16,000, the Dyuktai population was living in the Lena River drainages and the Aldan River drainages. And it's not too far from there. That's quite a distance over rugged terrain, but it's not too far from there to Bering Strait, and they might have brought material and genetics in. And in fact, there is a genetic model that allows us to think about if a lot of small populations are moving independently, each one small, drift is causing each one to lose genetic variation, there might be a way to arrive at a identifiable Native American genome by the time these multiple populations arise here, having lost much of the variation behind them, such that we no longer see it in Asia. In my view, it's a bit of a stretch, but it's possible. It's technically possible in a genetic sense. There's another problem. If that happened 13 to 16,000 years ago, as many archaeologists will still argue, we have early sites in South America, at Monteverde and Huaca Prieta, at 14.5 to 13,000 years ago. We have a number of sites in North America that predate 12 to 14,000. Is there sufficient time for people to diffuse throughout the entirety of the Western Hemisphere between, let's say, 13 and 16,000 and just 2,000 years later in southern South America? Actually, I think we now have sufficient genomic data, at least with modern populations and increasingly with ancient ones, that we can actually test that hypothesis. We just need to do it, and it hasn't been done yet. So I will close with a quote from one of my good friends and collaborators in Alaska, Owen Mason, who's a walking encyclopedia of Arctic prehistory. He was talking about archaeologists. I've taken out archaeologists. I think many of us could put our own discipline there. I'm certainly willing to put geneticists in there. We do practice selective vision. We forget to question our assumptions. We neglect or sometimes even reject evidence that doesn't seem to conform to our notions of how the world ought to work. And as Owen says, names take on a magical quality. For those of you that might have had an introductory archaeology course, Clovis First is one of those. We're not close to done. We know a lot more than we used to. The influence of genetic data and genomic approaches is really changing the landscape of how we view migration studies, dispersals, merging it with the archaeological and paleoecological records.